Good evening, everybody.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. I'm Julian Ryan, the chair of SIO, and I'm here to welcome two wonderful people for this story lab. Our host today will be Pete Griffin, who will man the controls in a minute and unmute himself. And our speaker today and presenter will be Tom Sparough, and he's going to be drawing an excerpt from his books and talking about trust and the dark shadows that destroy it. Thank you and welcome.
Well, thanks, Jules. It is my privilege to introduce Tom Sparough. And we go back a ways. And the first time I encountered Tom was back in 2011. National Storytelling Network had a conference in Cincinnati, Ohio. Well, when I got there, I realized that the conference wasn't actually in Cincinnati. It was in Covington, Kentucky, in a completely different state. Although from my hotel window, I could see Cincinnati across the river. But I attended a showcase, a regional showcase, and Tom was one of the performers. And as I read the description, I kind of thought, oh gosh, you know, a juggler isn't, you know, that's interesting. But when I watched Tom's performance, he did God's Week Off, in God's Week Off, apparently he invented juggling, which is a metaphor for life. And he did the 99 names of God in the Muslim faith. And I thought, you know, it's 10 years after 9/11. And with everything that was going on in the country, we're at war in the Middle East, and Tom chose to do the names of God in the Muslim faith, and it was fascinating. And a couple years later, the Storytelling and Organization Special Interest Group it was starting to fade, and the folks who were on the board said, you know, we've had enough of this and it's time to let it go. And the SIO was going to go the way of the dodo bird, but NSN sent out a note and said, hey, this is going to happen, you know, unless there are folks that are interested in helping perpetuate the organization. And so they sent out a note, and several folks, Tom and myself included, had raised our hands. And from that, we had an organizing meeting, and we named Tom the board chair because no one else would do it. And we have gone on from then. And Tom initiated the Story Labs, which was a wonderful idea. These monthly get-togethers where we would have an expert talk to us about storytelling in organizations, and that was just a terrific thing. So Tom has led the organization for a while, and then he's been on the board. And just recently, he published a book, Mr. Bait and Switch, Ghost Stories to Keep You and Your Organization Alive, which was just a wonderfully creative way to bring stories into organizations. And it was an approach way beyond anything beyond my experience. And a terrific book, terrific stories. And we have Tom here now, who is going to take us through at least one of those stories. So with that, to you, Tom.
Thank you, Pete. It is just a delight to be with everyone today. And I am going to share one of the stories from my book, Mr. Bait and Switch. And this story for me is about trust. And trust seems to be such a central element of life. I mean, if we're going to be happy, we have to have trust in our life. And if we're going to be effective storytellers, people need to trust us, and we need to trust our audiences. So we're going to explore this in a kind of creative way, but I just want to spend a little bit of time on the topic of trust, before I share the story with you. And the way I'm defining trust is assured confidence in someone or something. You know, we just have an assurance or confident that this person basically is going to do what they say they're going to do. And some like key elements in there is the person needs to be truthful. You know, when we're always on the lookout, our radar is up for things that are not truthful. People say things and we're always wondering, is that actually right? You know, and we're mulling this over. We're constantly searching, and our trust is diminished if people aren't truthful. Another aspect is it authentic? You know, you trust someone if it seems to be the person who's authoring it, the authenticity of what they're saying. It's linked, truthful, authentic. We have this assurance that we believe in them. And I think that, you know, it could kind of be summed up that when we have trust in someone or something, we think that that person or that organization or that product is going to do the right thing. And so this brings me to organizational storytelling, which I think that there's like 3 right things that we have to do if people are going to trust us. And I would say they are: tell the right story at the right time for the right people. And if you get any one of those 3 wrong, the trust in you is going to be diminished. So we need to tell the right story at the right time to the right people. And of course, many of us train people in the art of storytelling. And many folks who aren't steeped in story and narrative don't even realize that they're telling stories. And before I tell my ghost story, I want to share this organizational story with you of something that happened to me like 25 years ago. And I had a Volkswagen Super Beetle, and my Super Beetle was making a terrible noise on the brakes, you know, the kind of all the time, but especially when I put my foot down on the brake pedal, it made this grinding noise. And didn't have a lot of money. I was newly married. And somebody had told me, go to this place, S Motors. So I went into S Motors, and then they took my car and put it on the lift. And the only person in the room, the waiting area, was me. And right next to the waiting area was a little office. And in the office was a service manager. And I hear the service manager on a phone call. And this is what he says. He says, "We are killing it this month. You wouldn't believe it, man. Every week we've been doing 10,000. And this week, if I can just make a few things happen, we're going to hit 15,000. I know it's Thursday, man. We're already over 10,000. I'm shooting for 15,000. We're going to do it." And then they chit chat a little bit more, and that's the end of the call. Then, you know, the service manager calls me over. He says, "We've looked at your car, and I'm sorry to tell you this, but your brakes are just shot on the fronts. They're just, you know, you need pads, you need rotors. This is just not good. You know, it's not a safe situation." And I'm listening to his story, and I have his previous story in my mind that they're killing it, that he's going to do everything he can to hit 15,000. And he tells me, and this is a long time ago, and I don't have a lot of money. He says, "You know, it's going to be $550 to do this right." And I said, "Geez, I'm going to have to talk to my wife. And I know they're making noise, but they're still stopping. So I'm not going to be able to do it." And he says, "You look like a nice guy. I'll tell you what I'm going to do. We're going to knock off $100 and we'll do it for $450 for you. And I said, well, I really appreciate that, but I'm going to have to talk to my wife. I don't have that much money right now. And he says, the lowest I could do it for possibly would be $425. And I'll be losing money, but I will be helping out somebody, keeping them safe, you know, and that's the kind of business we run. And I said, thanks, but I can't do it right now. I have to check with my wife. And I'm walking out the door. He says, if you come back, it's $550. I said, okay. So I got home, told what happened to my wife, and she said, you know, somebody just mentioned to me another mechanic, and this mechanic is kind of in our neighborhood. Why don't you check him out? So I did, and it's a one-man operation. It's the F Motors, and I go into F Motors, and it's just the one guy, and he says, yeah, I'll take a look at it. And he puts it on his rack, you know, and I'm the only person in the waiting room, and he's in there, but he's doing the work. There's no service manager. And I hear him say, what the? And then he's clanging some tools, and then he's like, oh. And then he comes out and he wipes off his hands. He says, your brakes are fine. He said, you know, they're not in the best shape, but they're going to last another couple of years. But what you did have is a loose wire, because your car has the emergency brake. It's actually a wire, and that wire had come loose, and that was causing the emergency brakes to drag on your wheels, and that's making the noise. And I tightened that up. Everything's fine. And I said, how much? And he said, no charge. You know, it was an easy fix. You know, I don't need to charge you for this. And I said, thank you. And I gave him $10 as a tip. And I returned to him until he retired. And I told numerous people, including all of you, this story of a person that I trusted totally. And he was not the least expensive mechanic. Some of his repairs were quite expensive, but every time I took my car in, he fixed what he said he was going to fix. I always could trust that he would do it. And I think that this says so much about the stories we tell. If we go back to that little waiting area with the first guy talking to his friends, telling him that he's killing it, he was telling the right story to the right person, his friend, at the right time. He just didn't know that he was also telling the wrong story to the wrong person at the wrong time. And this happens. It's not always so clear, cut and dry. You can be talking to one person and not paying attention to the other person who's in the room or in the audience or in the boardroom. And you think you're killing it, but actually you're destroying it because you're not paying attention to the full scope of who's there. This little story, and I like that story because it's a mom and pop organizational story. And I think that many organizational stories are like that. They're kind of mom and pop. They're just, you don't even realize that this is an organizational story. But that story has stuck with me my whole life. It was such a contrast. And I have lots of them like that. And I think we all do, of just like people who did the right thing. Mm-hmm. And because they did the right thing, we had trust in them. And that trust is there until it gets diminished. When we talk about brand loyalty, this is the essence. People often say, you know, it's all about word of mouth. And the word of mouth is this trust. It's these experiences that we have that lead to brand loyalty. We are a Subaru family, you know, and I loved my first Subaru. And then when Subaru came out with their catchphrase, love, it's what makes a Subaru, I'm like, that's exactly right. and I got 300,000 miles on my Subaru car, and it took me through all kinds of situations that if I had just a two-wheel car without all-wheel drive, it wouldn't have worked. But it's, this brand loyalty comes from these mom and pop stories, everyday experience that we share with other people. I want to say that when we're doing organizational stories, and having listened to a zillion storytelling guests on our story labs, I think it all comes down to this. This is my synthesis of everything I've heard. And we could call it the value proposition of organizational storytelling. And it's this: the story you tell has to have value for the listener. If you do that, there's value and you're a success. And then there's all these different tangents, but that's the heart of it as I see it. The value proposition is when you tell a story, it's got to have value for the listeners. And there's a huge range, of life-changing to amusing, but most stories are somewhere in between. But it's about value as I see it. Now, I mentioned the dark shadows, and I just want to name a few of them. And certainly I'm not the only person who does this. And the person that we had last month, Bill Baker, told a story about a meeting that he was part of, that his boss tossed in a story, and it was a really heartfelt story, very emotional story, but it had nothing to do with the topic. It was a really good story, had nothing to do with the topic, and it blew the deal. Paul Smith, who's an author, he's been with our group, and he wrote Lead with Story. He's got another book, Sell with Story. But he opens his Lead with Story book by a way that somebody sabotaged themselves. And they told a story because people think, you catch people's attention by telling a story. So tell them a story. So he knew that much. So he told a story, but it turns out it wasn't his story. It wasn't his story, but he acted like it was his story. And then the story ended up in just a joke. And, so they wasted 5, 7, 8 minutes of the start of an important conference with somebody telling a story that really led to nowhere, that wasn't his story, that he acted like it was his story. He sabotaged himself. They didn't have any trust in him as a speaker after that. That's one of the things Paul starts his book with. And I think a clear way to sabotage trust is to lie or give the impression that something's happening when it's actually not happening. So we want to avoid lying if we're going to be trusted. And a thing that happens sometimes is we create unfulfillable expectations. And sometimes people say phrases like, listen to this next story and it will change your life. I guarantee it. This is dynamite. You have to listen to this story. And then you're like, oh yeah. And then you listen to it and you go, wow, yeah, that was good. I don't think my life's changed. And then, the trust in that person who said this will change your life is tempered, and we're thinking, well, maybe not. I can trust him. He certainly exaggerates, or she. Another is not meeting minimal expectations. So if I say, I have a very short story, this is going to take tops 2 minutes to tell, but let me tell it because I think it's important right now. And then I tell the story and it goes 10 minutes. People cut some slack. So if you say 2 minutes and it goes 5 minutes, they might, say, okay, it went a little longer. But if you go 10 minutes, you've exceeded the minimal expectation and you violated trust. It's one of the ways we screw up that way. A couple more, just lack of communicating. And I know the airlines are really onto this. So if you're sitting on the tarmac and your plane's going nowhere, it used to be that lots of times the passengers were left in the dark. But these days, the airlines are savvy to this, and they're like, the captain saying, hey, we're number 16 and there's some foul weather causing it. We could be here for another half an hour. I'll keep you advised. But if they don't tell you anything and you just wait there, people get really aggravated. Their trust in that airline goes away. So communicating is really important, and lack of communicating is one of those dark shadows. And one final one before I tell the story about trust is bad mouthing. And, I think most professional people, even when they disagree with someone, tend to keep their mouth shut unless they're in an advisory role and they need to speak up. But I remember I was working for an organization that was a community organization, a Germantown village. And the person who was coordinating the entertainment, and I was part of that entertainment, said he wanted to talk to me. And in the course, he used this disparaging remark about entertainers. He said, these idiot performers who think they know what they're doing. And I listened to him, and I realized that I was one of the idiot performers that thought they knew what they did. And my trust in that person went out the window because he forgot who he was talking to. I'm sure he would talk, he probably finished his meeting with me and went on to somebody else and said, I just talked with another idiot performer. So these are things to keep in mind. I think that they all make a lot of common sense. Where do they all come from? This is the question. And so now we get to my story. This is a fictional story. And the ghost stories that I've been telling are quite unusual in the organizational and business realm. For one, business storytelling is usually very short. And this story is going to go about 15 minutes. So it's quite long on that end. Also, business storytelling almost always has a very clear message of what people are to take away. I designed my ghost stories to not be so clear because what I wanted was people to think about the stories as they were hearing them. Welcome, Ken and Mary. So know that as you listen to this story, I hope you will spend some time thinking about it. And I'm just going to make sure we're all muted as we do this. There's one. There we go. Great. So this story is called The Dust. Leslie arrived at the office building. It was a single building nestled in a woods, and it had been there for 120 years. And she was there early in the morning, and she put the key into the lock and turned it and opened the door just a smidge. And there, a wedge of light streamed into the dark office area. And in that wedge of light, she saw little tiny particles floating, hovering, kind of dancing. And she looked at these little tiny specks of nothing that moved in the light and then out of the light. And when they weren't in that wedge of light, when they entered into the shadows, they disappeared. Of course, they weren't really gone. They just weren't visible. They were always there. There were hundreds, thousands, maybe millions of them in the office, floating around. And now she could see them and she wondered, what are they? Are they pieces of wood or strands of carpet or hair or skin? She coughed, opened the door all the way, turned on the lights, and the dust disappeared. She walked over to her desk and wondered, would there be another note? There had been a series of notes left on her desk, and as she approached her desk, she could see that there was another there because it was always a bright pink piece of paper. And she looked down at her desk, and there she saw the word, bitch. These notes had been left every day. Other notes said things like control freak, know it all, busybody. She wondered who was doing this. She was the last person to have left the office last night, and now she was the first person to arrive. Someone was coming in after hours and leaving these notes, these juvenile notes, and a plan hatched in her mind of what she was going to do tonight after work. And sure enough, she did it. She went home after work, she ate dinner, and then she drove back to the office. But she parked 2 blocks away. And then she walked along the streets, making sure that no one saw her. No cars were in the parking lot when she arrived. And then she went in. She didn't turn on the lights. And there, once she was in the office, some of the curtains in the back of the office, the west window, there was a slice of light coming in the dark office. And once again, she went over there and she looked at the dust. This dust that was hovering, dancing, and it was eerie. And she noticed that she was actually feeling frightened. And perhaps it was because of Margaret. Margaret had died in this very room about 3 weeks ago. She had come into work early and apparently had a heart attack, and the owner of the company came in and found her dead at her desk. And now she wondered if the presence of Margaret was still here. And then she remembered Margaret was not the only person to have died in this office. There was the original owner who had gone bankrupt and refused to vacate the building and had a shootout and killed 2 police officers before he himself was killed in this building, perhaps in the very place that Leslie was now standing. She walked over to the workstation. Her plan was to hide behind the copier where she could clearly see her desk and most of the rest of the office. And as she did, she thought, this building, even though it was big and had been remodeled, was not comfortable. People used to get along, and now there seemed to be no trust among the staff. A phrase kept being used. It was, it's a dog eat dog world. She sat behind the copier waiting, shivering from fright of her task. And then to calm herself, she actually fell asleep. And when she woke up, it was 2 o'clock in the morning. The first thing she did was look over, and in the very dim light, she could see that there was no new piece of paper on her desk, which she always kept clean. She stood up and she thought, if I go into Chuck's office, Chuck was the owner, and I open up the drawers in his desk, would I find this bright pink paper? And so she went in and she began to open up the drawers, and she found no pink paper, but in one of the drawers, she found some bright green paper. And on it, on the first sheet, it said bank fraud. And on the second sheet, it said death. And on another sheet, it said close now. Chuck was getting these notes too. Why hadn't Chuck said anything to her? And the company wasn't in financial straits. She was the office manager and she knew the accounting. She did payroll. It was fine. What was going on here? She went over to Steve's desk. Steve was one of the star salesmen and he was a practical joker. Maybe he was leaving these sheets of paper with these juvenile notes, and she found a drawer that had a bright yellow piece of paper on it that said, liar, and another that said, phony, and another that said, impotent. Steve was getting these notes. They had a good relationship. Why hadn't he said anything? Couldn't he trust her? She went back towards the copier, but then it occurred to her that maybe Margaret had been getting these notes too. And they had moved Margaret's desk into the storage closet, and she walked over and she creaked open the storage closet, and in there she could see nothing. So she took out her phone and she lit her flashlight on the phone. And as she went into that dank room that housed Margaret's desk, the light from the flashlight illuminated the dust. Those little particles that were fluttering in this storage area. And there she opened up the drawers, and sure enough, there was a bright orange piece of paper that said loser, and another that said incompetent, and another that said friendless. And as she read these hurtful messages, a wave of emotion came over Leslie, and she began to cry there in the storage room. Margaret was a good person. She was always there for other people. She didn't deserve to be treated like this. And why hadn't Margaret said anything to Leslie? Did no one trust anyone? It was just like this in this building. And she went back, pushed the drawers shut, and went back behind the copier, composed herself, and a couple of moments later, the hair on her arm began to stand up. And she thought, this is the moment. Someone is about to arrive. Or perhaps someone is already here, already has been here in the shadows, watching me. And she heard a rustling noise behind her, and on one of the shelves that housed the various reams of paper, a piece of paper came out of the stack. It was pink, and it was moving through the room toward her desk. She turned on her flashlight, and there was no one there. The paper was moving on its own, and it alighted onto her desk, and she saw a marker come up from her marker collection, and it began to do careful printing on that pink piece of paper, and it said, "Time is up." And Leslie thought that she was seeing where the marker was in the dust that was moving, the shadow of a hand in the dust. And she moved her flashlight up, and there she thought she was seeing a skull in the dust, looking at her without those eyes, the eye sockets on her. And she heard, "Kill or be killed." And Leslie lost consciousness, and she fell to the ground, and her hand held the flashlight, and it shone up into the office area. Her heart barely beating. She was hardly breathing. And the dust in the light continued to dance. But now there was another hand in the light, and it came down and touched the cheek of Leslie. And when Leslie opened her eyes, she saw in that light the face of Margaret in the dust, looking at her, stroking her cheek. And in that moment, Leslie moved her phone with the flashlight, and all she saw was shadow. But it came into her life. It came back into her life, just a speck, a tiny fragment, but she felt it. It was trust returning to her and to the office. And this is the story of the dust. I'm going to put just a couple of, well, 3 questions about this story in the chat. And then I'm going to break us into small groups so that you'll have a chance to just discuss these questions with the other members of your small group. We're not going to spend too much time at this. We're just going to have 7 minutes. You don't have to answer all of the questions in the chat, but just see if you can have some rich conversation, basically on this. And let me try to get this. My copy and paste didn't work the first time here. Oh, there we go. So I guess I got that in there twice. So it'll take me just a moment here to...
Hey, we're back.
Yeah, welcome.
was very cool. I've never done a breakout on Zoom.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, well,
That was
welcome back,
great.
everyone. We're pretty much out of time. There's a couple of final things we were going to do, but I did want to give you a chance. If anybody had a comment that they wanted to make or ask a question, we just have 2 minutes for this. Yes, Ken.
Okay, well, Tom, I think we can all agree that you told a wonderful story and that you warned us that it wasn't going to be as direct as it might be, kind of open to interpretation. So what David and I talked about initially was we thought that if you were going to take a story like that to a company or an organization, you might want to make your point a little bit more clear and less vague, if you know what I mean.
Well, everything is in its own world. So if you're brought into an organization and they say, we want to talk about trust, there may be certain aspects of trust. And then the questions are fashioned around that. And sometimes I change stories to put elements into it so that it's appropriate. So this was just kind of the broad stroke, but it can get more specific. And, sometimes people want it to be very direct and clear. I like to make people think and then just create their own connections, but I am interested to hear how that went for you guys. It sounds like you guys struggled a little bit with that, Ken.
Now, I may be part of the minority, but if anybody thought it was really clear, I'd love to hear that.
It's interesting you would say that because I started out talking about the ambiguity in the story. And yet by the end, I was saying that the decisions that you took in terms of the messages in those notes were consistently negative, and that was unambiguous. And I thought that the stories that you told us before you took us into the main story were a perfect frame for making the points about trust, about backbiting, and things of that nature. So it all, to me, reinforced the theme for today's meeting. I loved it.
I'm going to take an opportunity to use that as a segue. I like when things are visuals, and the power of our storytelling, it's not just what happens in the room, it what simmers and percolates when we've left the room and we're in another situation. And I challenge everybody, the next time you see those little dust particles or those little stream of lights, I guarantee we're going to think of Tom's story. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're looking for in storytelling, things that have feet, that they follow out of the conference room with the nice catered lunch and the doors and into other aspects around their desks. So you're right, Ken, it's not always specific, but I do think that's what we're there for, to not always be the linear people. We have enough linear PowerPoints and bullets. So I think a little ambiguity is good. So it's a frame, but I want to just build into one thing to share. What all of you are educators and are involved in training and learning theories. And one of the rules of thumbs is to share an important lesson more than once. So today I'm going to start a lesson and repeat it in the, as we say in Queen's terms, a do-over. I want to say thank you to Pete and Tom for being great hosts, but also for all of you for not just the hosting and the book, but they are been longtime board members. And this is one of two events that we're going to be doing where they're stepping down from the board this year at the end of the year here. And they've done so much to support us, as we've said before. They've championed us individually and about professional growth and our story work, and they've been great friends. So they're retiring. They better not disappear, because that would be too much for me to bear and the rest of us. And I know because we're different people on each call, I want to, like I said, do the Queen's do-over. And Pete is showing up next month on the 24th, a Tuesday, right before Thanksgiving. And Pete and Tom are going to switch roles. Pete is going to be taking to, where are you? Keep moving your rectangle. Pete's going to be doing his tales from his lessons learned from his time as a park ranger. And Tom's going to be interviewing him and being host. So we will see what they cook up then. And then we have a December story lab, but we're not there yet. Okay. So Ken, I know you did say it's something there, but I want to just take those moments before everybody else jumps off.
Oh,
So
sure.
I didn't follow my own instructions I give in every workshop I give to listen and not talk over anybody.
Right.
I can do that. I'm the chair.
You know, I agree with that team that the first story was very clearly in a business setting, and it talked at great length about trust and how that affects customers. And so that was a good sample of a story that talks to organizations or businesses about establishing trust with your customers. The second is the story that we heard, the ghost story, was a lovely example of really taking us to a place to see those dust particles floating in the air. That was beautifully done, masterful, Tom, honestly. However, I would worry about what people take away from that. And it's just because, you know, in advertising, you have polar bears having a soft drink, and then after the commercial, people go, "Don't you love polar bears?" What company was that for again? You know what I mean? So direct communication, if you're wanting them to take that away, if you're wanting them to kind of think, I suppose you can be more vague. And I will stop there. I don't want to dominate.
Yeah. But I want to say thank you and thank you and thank you. Tom, you've been incredible. And Pete, you've been incredible. You've been at the helm. I remember you, Pete, you remember him juggling. I remember this call that came out of nowhere one day. I was sitting minding my own business at my desk, and there was a voice on the other end. "Hi, I'm Tom Sparough. I'm part of SIO. Do you want to join us?" And a team, you've said this about me. I'm saying this about them. I've learned from the best about one by one. They're like, "Don't worry. There's no pressure to do anything. Just show up. Just show up. Just show up." And then slowly but surely you find yourself doing something, because when other people are doing so much, you're like, I gotta find time to step up here. So a team and Bill's hiding out there someplace. And yes, Sarah, yes, I will remember that comment. I'll definitely call you. We have a really great group. Not everyone in our group is here today. We have a great board, but we need more. So this is my subtle pitch to say, we really want to keep this going and keep reinventing ourselves and what we can do. The trust topic is timely and always relevant, and teaching others. We're working hard to collaborate with the other SIGs right now to make sure that they're welcome and they know they can come up, and a lot have come to our meetings. But I'm just joyful about this. This is the best phone call I ever answered that came from a strange phone number in our country. So sometimes it's good to pick up the phone and have a conversation and find out more. So so Pete, you go back to your official duties as host of this segment. So why don't you wrap up with Tom?
Oh, okay. Yeah, Tom, I got a couple of questions for you. Why invite me into all this for one? No. You've been on the board for a while. You helped revive the SIO. And two questions. What were you thinking when you raised your hand to volunteer for this? And the other thing is, looking back, what are one or two of the highlights of your time on the board on the reconstituted SIO?
Yeah. When I raised my hand to be part of this, I did have an agenda. And we've been doing what we call the story labs since I started. But before that, there were other phone calls that were designed to have the membership share what they were doing organizationally in narrative work. And I had listened to several of those, and I was just kind of flabbergasted that some of those calls that were all about story didn't have any story in it. You know, it was talking for an hour. Sometimes they went on an hour and a half, and there was not a single story in there. It was all about, you know, the value of story and about story and how we do story and who benefits from story. And I thought, you know, if I was in charge, every time we would have story be part of it. I would really like the storytelling sessions to have story in them. And then we did that, you know, and it's pretty much been that. And everybody I've worked with who's coordinated a storytelling lab, I've said, please ask the person to at least tell one story. And it's kind of interesting. Many people who know a lot about narrative and story are uncomfortable telling a story. Interesting fact. And as coordinators, we've had to coach people through that. And one other thing that I would say about what I've gotten out of this, one, I've loved our pre-conferences. I love the fact that we got Elizabeth Ellis and Annette Simmons and Andrew Tarvin to, you know, give us a whole half day. Those were highlights for me. But the international quality mixed in with the rich, diverse national quality, meaning Jules in New York, Pete in Alaska, you know, that pretty much covers it. And I'm in the middle in Ohio. I just really like that we're gathered from all over the place. But then when I first became chair, it was really wonderful that I was looking at our mailing list and there was somebody from France. And I noticed that her emails were bouncing back. And so I did some like careful looking, and I noticed that in the official NSN roster, her name was spelled wrong. And so her email was going out wrong. So I corrected that. And then suddenly I got this beautiful note from this woman from France. Oh, I thought that there was nothing happening. Thank you so much. You know, I've joined. And then she joined some of our calls, and that was so great. And then there was somebody from Germany, you know, who had written a blog piece for us, and she wasn't a native English speaker. And actually the person who was just on the call, Dave Brower, and myself helped edit her piece. And she was just like overjoyed. And then she came to one of our story conferences. So that was just so great. And now with Stuart Rothgeiser from South Africa on the call, and then also Artem in Russia. And then we've had people from England and Australia, just all over the globe for these story labs. That's been just wonderful for me. So those are some of the highlights, and thank you all. It's just great to be part of this group.
Thanks, Tom.
You're welcome. So next month, Pete Griffin.
Yeah.
Story Ranger. And also, you know, I just love Pete's work because it's organizational. You know, it's not just a single ranger, it's the whole Forest Service. It's being in the bureaucracy, it's managing people and wildlife. I love his stories. I'm really looking forward to next month, and I hope you can make it too. It's November 24th, which is a Tuesday before Thanksgiving, and it's at this same time, noon. So November 24th at noon, Pete Griffin.
Eastern Standard Time.
And that's Eastern, yeah, Eastern time. Unless it's daylight savings time then. But whatever Eastern time is at noon, but it will be early in the morning for Pete.
And one final thing, when we were getting ready to get on, a team gave us the word of the day. And what did you christen Pete and Tom? So you take it home, a team.
Progenitors.
Yes. So let that ponder for a while. But those are the two labels we've stuck on the two of them right now. So it's sticking. All right. Until the next time, thank you very much. The video will be up on our site at some point in the next week or so. So,
You know, if
good
I could stick in a plug, I was going to say, since Priyanka and Louisa are here representing South Asia and Singapore, you might want to rattle their chains about serving on the board. We've got
Okay.
that energy and creativity from the global South.
Great.
Yes, and we need more female presence on our board. Although since Pete and I are leaving, but the other guys are male.
Okay. We'll figure
Yeah.
it out for
So
sure.
be in touch with Jules. Hey, you guys, I just put in the chat a little link to this class that I'm doing in November. It's the first 3 Monday nights in November, and it's called Practicing to Play. It's kind of meditative aspects of playing and entering into the world of wonder and possibility. As you've heard, I am a juggler and I've spent my life playing, you know, and part of Ken, what goes on for me with story, you know, is part of it is just the playful aspect. And I also believe in story that if we can leave people with questions, it stays alive. If we leave people with answers, it pretty much is a done deal. So playing for me is part of that. And so that's what the class is about. If anybody might be interested in it, it's online. Just copy that link and you can get all the details.
Super.
Thank you.
All righty.
Thanks.
Listen, guys, thank you so much.